Hello, you're watching Talk On, the podcast of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle, Germany. My name is Christoph Brumann.
And I'm Jovan Maud. And in this podcast, we're going to be talking about current research and debates in the field of social anthropology. Today, I'm talking to Romm Lewkowicz, a postdoctoral researcher here in the Department Anthropology of Politics and Governance. And we're going to be talking about your research on biometrics and undocumented migration in Europe. So welcome, Romm.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so your dissertation that you did at the City University of New York was called Documenting the Undocumented. So it sort of starts with a paradox. Maybe you'd like to tell me, first of all, like how you came to this research topic and what's this paradox at the center of it?
Right. So I've been working on this research for many years and dealing with these questions for many years. And I think even when sort of the subject matter changed, and in the end, as I will speak in a second, this was a research about, it's an ongoing research about this biometric database and biometric experimentation in migration bureaucracy in Europe. This paradox, or this question about migration and documentation and undocumentation, was something that was sort of like following me. So when I lived in Israel, I used to work in this migrant rights organization, and I remember just migrants coming to our reception hall and like holding their very kind of crumbly and precious documents. Mm-hmm. And I just remember how powerful that image is. And then during the 2015 like Syrian migration crisis, I was just struck by how, you know, on the one hand you still had this like conversation of undocumentation, but on the other hand you saw that there were like these new kinds of technologies that were being experimented on migrants in the field of documentation. So that was kind of like the paradox that got me going, and to really trying to not think about migration through this idea of invisibility, but really try to think how migration, specifically in Europe, became this laboratory for experimentation in documentation and documentation technologies.
Okay, so what sort of experimentation are you talking about? Like, and why are these experiments happening?
So this is a good question. So when I started my research, I decided to look at this project called Eurodac, which is a European Union project. There's this ideal to create a pan-European database where all states sort of collaborate to create a unified biometric database for undocumented migrants. And so that would require that every migrant entering the EU unlawfully would have to be biometrically registered, starting with fingerprints, but now we see new attempts to move into facial recognition technologies, and that's now being debated in Parliament. And the interesting thing is that why this is happening now is for a few reasons. So the official explanation is that biometrics is the only way for European authorities to know who these migrants really are, and to also try to progress to this new era of migration documentation where physical documents would no longer be necessary in order for authorities to ascertain identity. So there is this notion here that papers can be manipulated, and they are dangerous and deceptive. Mm-hmm. So we want to come with this technological solution that would make migrants' body speak directly the truth. And so then to sort of circumvent fake papers and manipulation. And why this is happening in Europe specifically is because Europe has been very much obsessed with privacy concerns because of its communist and also fascist past. And so the deployment of biometrics for regular citizens has been quite limited because of this ethos of privacy concern. And this is why non-citizens have been for a few decades now a laboratory for experimentation in these technologies that you couldn't use for privacy-worthy citizens.
Okay, so you're talking about a complete sort of almost like a completely opposite treatment of European citizens and asylum seekers, undocumented migrants of various other kinds, right? And in your thesis, I think you talk about the way that, in fact, the sort of the free movement in Europe is kind of guaranteed precisely by producing this heightened level of surveillance outside. Is that a sort of an accurate description?
No, that's a fairly accurate, and to me was a quite surprising description, because again, I started my research during the quote unquote migration crisis of 2015. And, I heard that, the premise of why this was a crisis is this idea that, borders are crumbling and then we need better surveillance in order to protect European borders from, being jeopardized. And I thought of it as kind of like an emergency, an introduction of this new emergency reaction. And what I learned through this research, when I started doing this digging and trying to think about the history of where this experiment had started, I saw that it really came about already in the 80s with talks about Schengen and the abolition of internal borders in Europe. So it was this idea that biometrics would not only turn our bodies into identity documents, but it would also inscribe these abolished borders on migrants' bodies, right? So different states were sort of concerned that with the erosion of these borders, that unwanted migrants would be able to sort of move freely. And it was suggested as a technological solution to inscribe these borders, but also enforce a very important and controversial European migration policy, which is the Dublin Convention, which in a nutshell, it's this European law that says that a migrant, an asylum seeker, is the responsibility of the first EU country they enter. And sort of with biometrics, you would be able to sort of prove what is this first territory that a migrant entered to. And in the last few years, we see that there's a very small number of countries that are those countries of first entrance.
So while sort of Europe is presented as being a sort of in these terms, a singular territory,
right,
the Dublin Convention sort of creates a differentiation between territories.
I mean, we talk about paradoxes. Again, it creates another paradox of integration and disintegration, which is one of the paradoxes that I'm looking into. Because on the one hand, Eurodac was presented as kind of a machine that would help integration. Yeah. First, it would mean that different states in Europe would have to agree on who Europe's illegal migrant is, because before European integration, before Schengen, different migrants from different countries had different visa relations with these countries. So almost every subject in the world could get into what is today a European country without a visa because of past colonial ties or Cold War trade relations. And then to create European integration, you also had to come with an understanding of who is going to be this new figure of Europe's alien that we kind of take for granted. But it was a political process that demanded a political decision. And it also means that in order to facilitate this very convoluted technological apparatus, you would need collaboration. So that's the integration part. But of course, it also creates rifts and disintegration. So one of the things I'm looking at in the dissertation is how do you create this space? Because in order to be biometrically registered, you have to, there needs to be a space like a biometric border, and this biometric border is more of a camp, or in my case, I was looking at Chios Island. So I was looking at how this island in Greece becomes a territory that is taken for this biometric experiment. So of course, it also creates disintegration, because then you ask, like, where is the space in Greece? Like, is it inside Europe? Is it outside Europe? So there's a constant tensions between integration and disintegration that this creates.
So you talk about the island in Greece, and so could we take a step back? And sure. I'm kind of interested in how you approached your research, because you approached it as an anthropologist, not as say a legal studies person or a political scientist. Right. So how did you actually go about conducting this research, and what distinguished it as anthropological research?
Right. So, I mean, it was a challenge that I was working with throughout, right? Because my first question was, how am I going to study a thing like a biometric database? Like, do I look at the design? Do I look at the inner technological working? Do I look at the actual database? And then if it registers something on people, like how do I make it become visible? And that's kind of like the bread and butter of anthropological research, right? You have to have a site and you have to see something. And so I was like, where is the field site of this biometric apparatus? And I was trying to say, that you have to, it brings a challenge to traditional anthropological work. And so I did this kind of multi-sided research where I started in Brussels, where I look at the history of the project and spoke with kind of EU architects of the project. And then I moved on to sort of the second part of the dissertation, which is really looking at how these procedures are being experienced by the subjects of this surveillance apparatus. So for me, the most important thing, and I think that's our contribution as anthropologists, is say, there has been already a lot written about this project, Eurodac, by legal scholars or by policy scholars, but the reality of it is completely different than what the policy said. And I guess my argument was to say, if we really want to understand this specific project, but also the future of our citizenship, because one of my arguments is that this is a laboratory for experimentation in governance practices that would find their way into their mainstream in the end. So I'm saying that in order to really understand what this is, what this new form of government, what is this new experience of borders and migration, we have to study the people who are going through it.
Okay, and so how did you then study the people who are going through it? And this will take us back to the Greek island, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so Chios, and you describe it in your dissertation as a hotspot.
Right.
So what does this mean? Or is that's a complicated question?
No,
it's
a rich question. So so first of all, hotspot is not like my term, is part of the European Union plan, crisis management plan, as they say it. So after in 2015 you had this like rise of migrants coming into Europe, then they said, okay, we have to do this new thing to create these biometric hotspots in a few islands in Greece and in Italy. And there, migrants would not be able to move forward before they're being detained and biometrically registered on the Eurodac. And I was really there where sort of the island transformed from being a way for migrants to go into Europe to this new prison/waiting corridor biometric border And I was looking at this transformation and also the peculiar dynamics between sort of like Greek locals who were, that was there in Greece after years of, the debt crisis and forced austerity. So there were already economic tensions there before that things started.
And the feeling of Greece's position within the European project was
and
very
the feeling, and then one of the first reasons that I try to understand is like why would Greece agree to hold in and process all these people, or let European agencies do the processing on Greek island, where we also know that this biometric registration would also become the legal basis of why all these migrants would then have to be Greece's responsibility. So I was like, why? What does Greece have to like?
Because they're taking on apparently taking on a large burden there through this.
Right.
And just to be clear, so the hotspot you're talking about is part of Greek territory and therefore part of European territory, but is somehow then excluded from the normal legal provisions of European territory.
Right.
Is that how it works?
For migrants, yes, right. Because technically it's a Greek territory, so if it's, part of Schengen, it means that one is legally entitled to move freely across the continent. But with the introduction of the hotspot approach, migrants would have to then stay in these islands until they're being either processed and then moved to mainland Greece or another country for relocation, or deported or returned to Turkey.
So this reminds me a lot of Australia's approach to asylum seekers, which was known as the Pacific solution, where island states like Nauru and Papua New Guinea were sort of used as these liminal spaces where Australia was kind of administering them, but specifically because they weren't within the migration sort of zone for Australia. So I guess are these different policies influencing each other?
I mean, of course. And we also see now that there's this new initiative in the United Kingdom. I don't know if you saw it recently, the UK-Rwanda deal, which, I think this week or next week, the first plane of migrants from UK is going to take asylum seekers to Rwanda. And this deal is basically saying that from now on, certain asylum seekers would just be moved to Rwanda and being taken, just processed there. But also if their application is successful, would have to stay there. So I think for a long time, you see different countries are trying to engage in this type of like jurisdiction shopping. Mm-hmm. And I think what's interesting about the European Greece case in comparison with Australia, what's really interesting is that this island is supposedly not Australian territory, right? So you can keep the migrants there, but also not subject the country to the legal provisions of, for instance, the refugee conventions, right? Mm-hmm. So it's completely externalized. And then here in Greece, you see a part where Greece itself, in a way, is being deterritorialized from Europe and is being like reshaped as this external territory, but also a territory of humanitarian intervention. So around the crisis and around the biometric project, you saw for the first time Europe was channeling humanitarian aid money to a European territories and inviting, or not inviting, but creating the atmosphere for all these international humanitarian networks and governance that would, until the time, would go, some to like Africa or Asia. Always this idea of something that happens in the global south being introduced with its management logic into the global north.
Okay.
Yeah. So
these are very interesting processes you're talking about. So could you speak a little bit more about the impact that Eurodac had on undocumented migrants, on asylum seekers, and so on? Like, what did your ethnography
So
find?
it had a lot of impact, and completely not the impact that I suspected it to have when I entered the research. So when I entered the research, I sort of believed the policy around Eurodac and also my own kind of like big brother intuition, you know? So I came with it, and the idea sounded completely dark to me, you know, that we're going to... So like my original premise was, you know, they presented as this, you know, complete crisis and chaos, but actually we're seeing this, you know, big computer, new surveillance, everything is going to become transparent and managed. And also, I believed sort of what Eurodac said, that that this is going to be a research about how identity papers are not going to take part in migration anymore. So it's going to be this completely futuristic thing where body creates data. But then I realized that that first, that it wasn't a complete chaos and it wasn't a big brother situation, but also that Eurodac did not eliminate paper, but it actually created new types of paper. So I will have to address the two. These are like the two surprises that I had. Okay. In terms of the surveillance, I mean, the main paradox here is that you have a surveillance mechanism that doesn't really want to know.
Okay, what does that mean?
That means that, for instance, let's say if you put surveillance on criminals, you try to like understand who you are, where they come from, what are their psychologies, who they talk to, where do they cooperate, and it produces these types of knowledges that are being archived. And here you have a surveillance mechanism that is basically interested in the coordination of bodies and the rejection of certain, you know, subjectivities from being registered. So at the end of the day, what this biometric mechanism try to do is really to keep these people as the responsibility of frontline states like Greece and Italy. But then the reality on the ground very quickly became that migrants would be registered in Greece, and then, you know, they would be pushed by Greece to just move to another country because they would say, okay, we'll give you an asylum interview in 10 years and, you know, here's the way. And, you know, they would keep a blind eye if they would use like false documents. So they were kind of pushed to move to another European country, and then they would come here, for instance, and Germany would say, no, but your fingerprints are Greek, so you are Greece's responsibility, but Greece would not take them back. So in the end, it would not create this situation where everybody is controlled, but it would just create these subjects that cannot be registered anywhere. So I know a lot of migrants who I met a few years ago in Chios who are now in Germany, but they're not being deported, but they're also not being absorbed here because for Germany, they are sort of Greece's responsibility, even if they cannot be returned there. So it just creates more limbo and more kind of ambiguities. And at the end of the day, these are not, most of the subjects that I interviewed are not people who are trying to go underground or who are trying to disappear. There's mostly people who are asylum seekers who sort of want to get their case across. And they're also kind of crave for a government or a state that sees them because they come from states that from different reasons have crumbled. And
so they're sort of they're looking for a sort of an official identity in some form.
Yeah.
Because, you know, the sort of a common narrative that we hear about asylum seekers is they're actually destroying their papers or trying to avoid being identified.
Exactly.
But in this case, you're talking about a desire for identity which the states themselves actually want to avoid.
Right, so that really surprised me because I thought that it's going to be that the entire dissertation is going to be about people who cut their fingers. And I just assumed that everyone would try to like avoid being registered on Eurodac. And then I saw that a lot of people were actually really looking for that engagement for different reasons. Some of the reasons was, I mean, some people have been just displaced for so many years in different places in the world. And so for them, there was something tempting about this idea of biometric as this solid, uninterruptible evidence of their presence in Europe. And they also saw it as kind of like an advanced form of state making that they wanted to be a part of.
Okay.
But at the same time, it didn't mean that they were completely ready to be subjected to the system. They were just conscious of the fact that in order to gain legality in Europe, you have to constantly shift from being knowable and unknowable to this legible and illegible to the system, because it's the same system that might deport you, but it's also the same one that can grant you certain benefits and protections.
I see. Right. So maybe we can just finish up with the outlook from this research.
Yeah.
Okay. So you said that Eurodac and the system that it sort of underpins is a kind of experimentation in expanding this potentially for European citizens. So what evidence did you find that sort of supported that idea?
Well, first, they're just the facts on the ground. So they're constantly adding new types of databases. So right now, there's this new idea of linking like 5 existing databases into what is called Common Identity Repository that is going to be approved, I think, next year, and which will then potentially be one of probably, I think, the second largest biometric database in the world after India's, with more than 300 million records of different degrees, again, of non-Europeans. But then you see like the degrees. So with Eurodac, you really have this like invasive, like biometric fingerprints, but then you have a more kind of dispersed monitoring of migrants from countries who don't need a visa, where you can take, where the biometric printing is limited to like the document itself, but not to a database. And you keep seeing just this function creep.
Right.
And how even Eurodac, that originally was meant to be limited for the deployment of the Dublin regulation, we see how it's being used for all these different purposes right now. So there's already access being given to police departments,
criminal cases.
Exactly. There's talks about an integrated criminal record database. So there are all these projects that are now being labeled under the very complicated terms. What's it called? I'll have to remind myself in a second. It's this jargony. It's basically a term for how all these computers and databases are going to speak to each other. But I'm going to have to take a second to remember.
Okay, but it sounds like what you're talking about is something. There's something big brothery about it, even though that's not what you found on the ground.
Again, it would maybe provide an infrastructure for such thing to exist, but then there are so many. Because Europe, at the end of the day, is not integrated, and there are still so many political issues with imbalances of powers between the North and the West, and the East and the South. So it just becomes looped into these different political dynamics, and it's not, as long as you're not going to have. So maybe that's a good thing, that as long as you don't have fully, European integration, this surveillance system is going to become like looser and looser, but it's still, you have some consensus around surveillance of the non-European.
Okay.
That's, I guess, my argument. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we've run out of time, so
Great.
I'll say thank you very much.
Thank you for
telling me about your research, and good luck as it proceeds along.
Yeah, thanks for having me. That was fun.
Thanks. Okay.